A judge in New Brunswick has found Dennis Oland not guilty of murdering his father. The death of Richard Oland in St. John 8 years ago shocked the city. In 2015, a jury found Dennis guilty of second-degree murder. Now, that verdict was overturned on appeal. Today, we got the conclusion from his retrial before a judge alone. The CBC's Harry Forstall is at the courthouse in St. John. So, Harry, thank you for joining us. Take us through the judge's reasoning.
Well, RT, Justice Terrence Morrison arrived to a packed courtroom this morning and an overflow crowd in another courtroom, and made clear in the remarks he gave in his 20-minute summary of his decision what the burden of proof would be. He said that the Crown had to prove beyond doubt that Dennis Oland struck the fatal blows that killed his father, Richard Oland. And then Justice Morrison went through some of the evidence used by the prosecution to try to establish that guilt. He talked about the sports jacket that Dennis Oland had worn that showed flecks of his father's blood on it. He spoke about the lack of trace evidence on or near Dennis Oland, trace evidence being any indication of, for example, blood spatter on shoes or inside the vehicle Dennis Oland drove that day, or on any of the items that he happened to be carrying in his hands in the course of that day. He talked about the lack of a murder weapon. In the end, Justice Morrison told the courtroom that the Crown had failed to show sufficient motive. He said an interesting thing. He said, "I cannot accept outright the accused's denials of guilt." But then he went on to say, "I'm not satisfied the prosecution has proved beyond a doubt that Dennis Oland is guilty of the murder of his father," and he declared Dennis Oland not guilty. Now, after that, when the lawyers came out of the courtroom, we heard from Alan Gold, the lawyer for Dennis Oland, and he reflected on the shortcomings of the case, and especially on the failure of the St. John Police Department to carry out a thorough investigation in his mind. He referred to the tunnel vision that the police force showed in focusing in how they focused directly on Dennis Oland as the only likely perpetrator in this case. Here's some of what Alan Gold had to say.
I'm disappointed in a police force that I say demonstrated tunnel vision, but this is a phenomena that courts have struggled with and ministers of justice have struggled with. So there's nothing, in a sense, in an unfortunate sense, there's nothing unusual in what took place here.
Alan Gold speaking there, making clear he was not satisfied with the shortcomings of the investigation by the St. John Police Force, and nor clearly was the judge, because he delivered a verdict today of not guilty.
And while, Harry, we did hear from the defense, we did not hear from the Oland family today, but we did get a little bit of insight from Alan Gold about what might be next for the family.
Well, this is, of course, a difficult time, and what Alan Gold was saying after the verdict today was, great. They found Dennis Oland not guilty of a crime he did not commit. The question now is, who did commit this heinous crime, this terrible attack on Richard Oland, a member of the Oland family? And he urged people to keep in mind that the Oland family, while they may have their son and nephew back, there's still the question of who killed Richard Oland. Here's Alan Gold again.
Just remember, Dennis lost his father in a brutal murder. There's not a lot of happiness in this whole story, and he's been on trial for 6 years, and before that he was a suspect for 2 years. So, there's not much to rejoice about other than finally the appropriate result was reached, and now the family can start rebuilding and living their lives.
Alan Gold speaking there, the lawyer for Dennis Oland. This has been an 8-year legacy, RT, since Richard Oland was found murdered in his office. 6 years since his own son, Dennis Oland, was accused of that murder. It has been the topic of conversation, not just in the city of St. John, but across this province. And even with today's not guilty verdict, it's hard to believe that topic of conversation won't continue for some time to come.
All right, thanks for this, Harry. That's the CBC's Harry Forstall in St. John.